The following BLTV program is brought to you by O'Flaherty Law. Please enjoy.
Welcome to Learn About Law. My name is Kevin O'Flaherty from O'Flaherty Law, and today we're going to explain Illinois consumer fraud law. The Consumer Fraud Act is a statute that's intended to protect consumers from deceptive business practices by people in the course of trade or commerce. Basically, it gives you a shortcut to prove fraud if the fraud occurred in the course of trade or commerce. So what we're going to do is talk about how common law fraud works, how consumer fraud is different from common law fraud, and why it's easier to prove consumer fraud than it is common law fraud. So let's start by talking about common law fraud. Common law fraud is basically any type of fraud other than consumer fraud, so anything that's not a claim under the Consumer Fraud Act. There's 5 elements of common law fraud, and an element is something that you have to prove in order to succeed in your claim. The 5 elements of common law fraud are that the defendant made a false statement of material fact to the plaintiff, knowing that the statement was false at the time that it was made, that the defendant intended the plaintiff to rely on the statement when the statement was made, that the plaintiff did act in reliance on the statement, and that as a result of that reliance on the false statement, the plaintiff suffered damage and injury. So those are 5 things, and if you can't prove any one of those 5 things, you can't win your common law fraud case. Now, the Consumer Fraud Act is intended to make it easier to prove fraud if the fraud occurs in the course of trade or commerce. So let's talk about the elements of consumer fraud. So the first element is a deceptive act or practice. The second element is that the deceptive act or practice was done with the intent that the plaintiff rely on the deceptive act or practice. The third element is that the deception occurred in the course of trade or commerce. And the fourth element is that there were damages to the plaintiff as a result of the deceptive act or practice, the violation of the act. So why is consumer fraud easier to prove than common law fraud? One reason is that you don't have to prove that a knowingly false statement was made. You don't have to get in the head of the defendant. All you have to prove is that a act of practice occurred that in the course of commerce which tended to be deceptive. So you don't have to prove something we call mens rea, which is that the act was intended to be deceptive. You do have to prove that the act was intended to induce reliance by the plaintiff, but the second reason it's easier to prove is that you don't have to prove that the plaintiff actually did rely on the statement. So in common law fraud, you actually have to prove that not only was the false statement made, but the plaintiff actually took that to heart and acted in reliance on it. In consumer fraud, you don't have to prove that the plaintiff acted in reliance on the statement. So this is basically a simpler path to causation. And I want to back up the difference between the deceptive act or practice in consumer fraud and the knowingly false statement in common law fraud gives you a wider range of facts that would lead to fraud in the consumer fraud context. So you've got a wider range of facts based on, not having to prove a knowingly false statement. And secondly, you've got not needing to prove reliance, which gives you a simpler path to proving that the defendant's act caused the plaintiff's damages. The last reason that consumer fraud is easier to prove is because it's a different evidentiary standard from common law fraud. You have to only prove consumer fraud by a preponderance of the evidence, which means that the plaintiff's version of the facts are more likely than not to be true. So 51% chance they're true. Common law fraud has to be proven by clear and convincing evidence, which is a higher standard of proof than a preponderance of the evidence. So it's got to be really likely that the plaintiff's version of the facts are true if it's a common law fraud claim. So that makes, not only is there a simpler path based on fewer elements you have to prove, but there's a lower evidentiary standard. There's a lower burden of proof on the plaintiff in consumer fraud claims. So if you have any questions, please leave us a comment in our comments section. Check out more of our articles and videos about nearly every area of law at learn-about-law.com, and please subscribe to our YouTube station. Thanks.
Thanks so much for watching our video. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below. Click the subscribe button for new videos every week, and download and review us on iTunes. Visit learn-about-law.com for other legal-related articles and videos. Visit our business podcast and video blog, seizeyourbusiness.com, and visit Making Real Estate Fun for real estate videos and podcasts. Call us at 630-324-6666 for a free consultation.